Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Refold podcast. My name is Clayton, also known as George Pig, and I manage the community here at Refold. Today, I'm having a chat with Vernon. Vernon has a unique story of moving to Kenya when he was a child, where he picked up Swahili and a bit of Ndile all through immersion. All right, and Vernon, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Vernon, do you want to start off by telling us who you are, what your background is with language learning, with Refold?
Sure. I grew up very bilingual in South Africa, um, and then moved to Kenya when I was 8 years old. And then during my time in Kenya, we learnt several languages, and my father was involved in uh, translation work, and so language learning was a part of our lives for a while. I particularly learnt Swahili during that time, and then language. We learnt a lot of languages, kind of bits and pieces over that time, and but never really thought much about how we were learning them. They just kind of came, and although I'm sure my father did, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but that was that early exposure. Then I became a tour guide. Well, I did some studying in South Africa, and then became a tour guide in Namibia around 1989 or whatever, 1998, and lived there until COVID time. And so I was exposed to some really interesting languages there, such as the Khoi or Khoisan languages, but never really got time to learn them. Picked up a little bit of German, and I got interested in learning languages towards the end of my last few years in Namibia, when it actually came when I was not doing guiding, and I had a time when I was driving very long distances on my own, because I was doing some support for camps and doing some guide training stuff and various things like that. And it just ended up that I spent a huge amount of time on the road, and it's big open roads, nothing much to do, hours and hours on the road on my own, usually with quite a loaded kit, so driving a big vehicle slowly, and so I had time. And so I started with things like Pimsleur tapes, not really picking any language particularly. I mean, I'd kind of try one for a while and then switch around. And then the company that I was working for started working in Chile and Argentina, and so I was kind of interested in going to do some guide training there. It wasn't like that was on offer, but it was something that I thought I could work towards. And so then I started focusing on Spanish, and that was just before the pandemic. And then during the pandemic, I sort of dropped languages because I moved to the UK, where I am now, and I became a software developer. So I spent a lot of time, the pandemic basically, I spent teaching myself how to be a programmer. It had always been a hobby, but moved to the UK. My family is here, and so. And I actually don't really remember. I mean, all my language learning stuff. So when I came to the UK, I actually switching to French, thinking that that's the most practical language, and I just didn't find it that fun. And then I thought, I was actually really enjoying Spanish. Let me go back to that. And I was trying various things, again with Pimsleur tapes or what's Paul Noble tapes. I don't know if you know them. And then I guess just looking around, being frustrated and going, I want to succeed this time, looking around online, gradually I picked up bits and pieces. I'm sure the main one that got me into the idea of comprehensible input and immersion learning. And really, it's been about a year now that I've been doing Spanish pretty intensely.
Interesting. So, to unpack, you grew up in a mixture of places, right? Your early childhood was spent in South Africa. I think Pretoria, right?
Yeah, the majority of the time in Pretoria.
Yeah, which is definitely more Afrikaans than not, I think.
That's right.
And then you moved to Kenya, where you acquired Swahili and some bits and bobs of other local languages. Then you spent some time in Namibia. You didn't mention it in this story, but based on our previous conversations, you kind of sort of got the gist of German through osmosis, right? Because you work with tours and, German Southwest Africa, now Namibia. And obviously speaking Afrikaans gives you a bit of a leg up. And then, and then you started, the old Pimsleur, Paul Noble sort of treadmill.
Exactly.
Okay. And why did you guys move to Kenya?
So my parents are missionaries, and my father was working on a language called Rendili, which is in the middle of nowhere. I think there's about 30,000 speakers. So a very small language. It had no alphabet, it had no grammar system, and their mission was to translate the Bible into that language. So we moved there in 1980, and then my father started very intense for about 4 years. He was just learning the language, and became pretty much one of the only outsiders who can speak that language fluently.
Okay. So he was sort of associated with SIL.
That's right.
Summer Institute of Linguistics. Yeah. I'm not a missionary myself. I'm not religious at all. But
likewise.
I do enjoy linking the SIL site simply because they have a really good glossary of linguistics. And their work in Africa shows. If you go to the SIL link, what they call it, glossary of linguistic terms or something, you look at tone, they'll also give you a lot of information about the type of tone that you find in Africa. And Rendile it's a Cushitic language, is what I understand. So it's related to Somali. It's related to Oromo.
Sorry, I was quite amazed in London. I was working in London for a couple months, and I got on the tube and heard some people sitting opposite me speaking, and I understood what they were saying, and they were Somalis. And I just, I don't feel like I can remember Rendili, but yes, it's very close to Somali.
That whole sort of Horn of Africa area has those Cushitic languages. And I don't know too much about them, but I know that we have our graphic designer is from Ethiopia, and his main language is Amharic. He's sort of similar to you, where ethnically he's Oromo, but he grew up speaking, I think he switched to Amharic when he was like 6 years old, he said, because he didn't live in an Oromo area. And Oromo, Somali, Rendile, they're all those little Cushitic languages, which is really cool.
Yeah,
And I did
yeah,
not know that there was that level of, you got, bits and bobs of what they were saying.
yeah, yeah. So somewhere there's still some Rendili buried deep in my mind. I I struggle. I mean, I can't really say much other than very obvious stuff. But if I hear it, I can still. I'm still surprised that I can understand bits and pieces. So I guess we, as a child, I don't really know how much Rendili. We used Rendili only because I walked a lot. I've been interested in nature. Obviously, I became a tour guide. I'm still deeply passionate about nature and the outdoors. And we had this great backyard of just miles and miles of nothing. The Rendili people are nomadic, so they live in little villages, and it's just out in the middle of the semi-arid area. And it was safe, relatively, although a lot of northern Kenya is extremely dangerous. Being there in the middle of the desert, it was just those people. So we would just walk. You could go into a village, they give you water, they give you some food. So we would chat to people like that. But I played with the school kids, and they were all wanting to speak Swahili. So yes, I mainly learned Swahili.
Right. So Swahili, in a kind of sort of unique situation for Africa, is sort of a lingua franca. A lot of Africa, for whatever reason, uses sort of these Western colonial languages. Not to say that you can't colonize from the East. A large part of Somalia is actually in Ethiopia, because of some wars and such. But French, Portuguese, English, Afrikaans, to a lesser degree German, these languages tend to be the lingua franca. But in East Africa and Kenya and Tanzania, you get this sort of Swahili as the lingua franca.
Yeah.
And how was that learning Swahili? And was the Swahili spoken where you grew up with the Rendile kids and such? Was it the Swahili Sanifu, the sort of the formal Swahili, or was it closer to like what they call Sheng?
I don't know terminology at all. I was a kid, but
Okay.
it was not Safi Safi Swahili. It was a mixed bag of words, just enough to communicate. But then I took Swahili as my language at school, and so I mean, you asked how was it learning it? It's been very interesting to think back now, knowing a bit more about language acquisition, as to how we did it. And I don't think we ever. I don't know exactly how much intentionality there was to language learning for us as kids. It just kind of happened. But I was 8 when we moved there, so I was old enough that I can actually vaguely remember learning the language. I think it's very interesting to sort of think about how input works, because I think we were largely getting input just around with the kids, and we sort of learned phrases. I remember going home and we'd sort of recite phrases and say, "Oh, we were saying this today, and we were saying this today." So we were outputting very early, but it was sort of like, oh, this fun thing I caught. This is never really thinking that it's all building towards learning. But we certainly understood a lot, and then holidays in Mombasa and that kind of thing, where the Swahili is a bit more pure Swahili. There I would didn't take that long before we understood Swahili, through and through. One thing that I know is sort of in my schooling time, we really sharpened up with the use of noun of the noun classes. So where you can sort of do tricks by changing the noun to a different noun class, and it changes what it means. Like getting to the point where
a good example of that, I think, might be what's the word for bird?
For bird, I don't know. If I try to think of Swahili now, Spanish comes up.
Yeah, give me one sec. Bird in Swahili. Let's see here. Ndege.
Ndege, yes.
And it's also airplane.
Yes.
But if you make everything agree with the animate, then it's going to mean bird. And if you make everything agree with the inanimate, then you would be able to, so like, I guess in that case, you're not technically changing the noun itself, but rather the stuff that agrees with the noun. If you change it, you can change it from animate to inanimate and get bird versus airplane. But my Swahili is way more basic than yours, I'm sure. I only have a sort of an high-level overview of the language. Very cool. So yeah, I've heard that in Kenya, especially, compared to some place like Tanzania, the Swahili spoken is largely L2. It's largely like non-natives, and I've heard that a lot of those, so like Swahili, the standard Swahili Sanifu, it has sort of like 15 or so noun classes. And I've heard that in Kenya in particular, it tends to collapse a little bit. People don't make as many distinctions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what we did at school, my high school Swahili was essentially the Zanzibar. We called it Zanzibar Swahili, and we did we actually did the entire school curriculum of Swahili within a couple of years. Sort of high pacing it and trying to. So that was my first, learning the languages. This is one of the things with language learning. I knew nothing about noun classes, even for the first 5 or 6 years speaking the language. Only later, and some of it was, they would tell us, "Oh, you guys don't know this in school," and then we go, "Oh, actually, we sort of do. We just didn't know that we knew it." But yeah, we certainly, I learned all about the more structured language. So I think there's this tier of it's not that, when you're up in northern Kenya, you're very far from pure Swahili. Although the school kids, to some extent, it depends what kind of schooling they had. Some of them learn pretty good Swahili. So it varies. All over the country, it varies a lot.
For sure. And that's really not too uncommon, I think, in languages that are largely spoken by non-natives. English is an example. There's all sorts of sort of strange, well, I say strange, but non-normative English spoken by non-natives. You get this sort of European English, Filipino English, Indian English, and things could be a little bit different. And I think that's the case. And Swahili is a very severe case of this, where I think that people who are only exposed sort of to the trade form of the language may not always have good comprehension of the stuff that they speak in, Zanzibar, so-called standard.
Yeah.
I guess
if I try to listen to like the news, I'm totally lost. I don't understand anything. But if I listen to day-to-day stuff, I understand pretty well. So I think the level to which I've been really interested in thinking about what was our level really. How well did we do? I mean, we were fluent, as in we could we spoke extremely well. I mean, as in functionally, we could get around and do whatever. And but I'm not sure to what extent I actually picked up like true Zanzibar Swahili.
Yeah, and 2023 is an amazing time to be alive because obviously you grew up in very interesting places. Kenya, South Africa, living in Namibia. But even where I live, I can open up TikTok and I can get videos of people from Congo speaking Swahili.
Mm-hmm.
And that was interesting. Like the plural of mtoto is watoto in standard Swahili. But in Congo, they say batoto with a B sound. And just like things like that.
Okay.
I love it. I love it. I love that if I want to hear somebody from Namibia, somebody who's like ethnically Griqua or something speaking Afrikaans, I can open up TikTok or YouTube and get somebody. It's like, this, and that's really cool. That's an amazing time to be alive.
Absolutely. Yeah. I still, I know on one of your recent podcasts, you were talking about dabbling. And to a large extent, I still aspire to be a dabbler because languages are just so fun to listen to, and exactly, the access that you have to all these things now is just incredible.
Sure, I mean it's amazing. I've Afrikaans is one of my sort of special interests for whatever reason. I don't want to say obsessed, but I really like it. And I've never been to to an Afrikaans speaking area, but I've heard Afrikaans from Namibia. I've heard Afrikaans from different parts of South Africa. I've even heard Argentinian Afrikaans because of the internet. Yes. Yeah. So there was I don't know the name for them. There was an Afrikaans colony in Argentina. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it.
No, that's very interesting.
Yeah, let me see. Afrikaans in Argentina. South African Argentines. Today, Afrikaans is only spoken about 300 people, sometimes referred to as the Boer colonization of Argentina. Yeah, so in 1902, after the Second Anglo-Boer War, a lot of Afrikaners moved to Argentina.
Okay, wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and actually, I think there are at least 2 different documentaries, and they actually have some of the elderly people who still speak Afrikaans speaking it, and it's very interesting to listen to. Because it's sort of 1900 predates standardization. They standardized Afrikaans in like 1925 or something. So you get this pre-standard Afrikaans with some old-timey features and things that they don't do in South Africa. And yeah, all without having ever been to Argentina or South Africa or Namibia. And that's just cool.
Very cool.
And since Spanish is your target language, maybe in the future you can take a trek out to Argentina, practice Spanish, and get to meet some Afrikaans speakers.
Yeah. It's certainly interesting. I've been focusing on Argentine Spanish, so I know that most people don't do this in the community, but I've been doing italki lessons all along, and the teacher that I'm working with is from Argentina, so I've largely been focusing my input with Argentine content, and so I'm really interested.
It's a good one to do. Argentina is at that sweet spot of being sort of connected enough where, like, your average Argentinian has access to make content, you know. So a whole bunch of streamers are Argentinian, a whole lot of content creators, YouTubers are Argentinian. And that's one thing that I've noticed, is that there just seem to be tons of Argentinians online, and it makes the dialect very accessible.
Yeah. I do find, as I'm getting, I kind of went back and forth about. I know that this is something that's talked a lot about a lot in the community, but I went back and forth with how much I just focus on Argentine content. So in the beginning, I was just doing that. Well, I mean, not in the beginning, but when I started deciding that Argentine Spanish is interesting, I'm interested in Argentina and Chile for nature sake and things like that. But I think at one stage I just wasn't finding enough simple content from Argentina, and then I largely started doing. So at the beginning of this year, I started through the Dreaming Spanish stuff, and kind of just used this. There is the one girl from Argentina, but I got through her stuff quite quickly. So so I was kind of mixing it up, but now I'm back to pretty much purely listening to Argentine stuff, and now I can follow a lot of nature stuff, which there's fascinating videos of. And so I'm getting enough content that I can understand that I can make it fully Argentine at the moment.
Yeah, there's an abundance of content. And I have seen content personally. I'm into horror, just like horror fiction. It's one of my sort of genres that I like. And there's a big YouTuber, Dross, and he's also written a couple of books. And there was a famous horror book, and the English is called Tender is the Flesh, but the original was an Argentinian book called Cadáver Exquisito, which sort of about sort of like capitalism and stuff, and the sort of apocalyptic future where there are human meat farms. And I won't get into it on the podcast, but it's a very interesting book, sort of an allegory about late stage capitalism and stuff. And there's just heaps of content from Argentina, for sure. And I think officially at Refold, we recommend focusing on a dialect later than sooner. So the official recommendation is, don't worry about focusing on a dialect until you start to output, at which point you would ideally choose a parent or so and focus. But that's a whole debate for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm super interested in the whole Refold thing. I mean, when I really started to focus on Refold, I read the guide through and through, and I'm really interested. But I'm also not needing to be a purist. My language learning is very much a hobby. I don't have a real reason to do it. I mean, I have some potential ways that I could use it in the future, but it's a hobby, and I'm just kind of trying things and not worrying too much about being doing it purely. But I'm very, very interested in the whole language acquisition, how the mechanics of it work. So I'm not that worried that I've kind of done things in weird orders, and I guess most people do this. I keep switching around and trying different things and seeing what.
I think
what
purists
fits.
are a minority. Really,
Yeah.
I think most people they try different things, because they have different preferences and different goals. Now, I personally am a big believer in getting as much exposure to a large variety as you can. A good example is I taught English for a while, and I worked for a Japanese eikaiwa. And I would have students come to me, and they would say, Clayton, why don't I understand my coworkers from Singapore? Why don't I understand my coworkers from Australia, New Zealand? I'm like, well, I'm American. I speak American, and most of what you consume and interact with on your personal time is American. And then you're confused as to why you don't understand these other varieties of English. And it comes down to exposure. Really, it's all about exposure. And yeah, I would hate to see that happen to people in their L2, where they only listen to one form of the language, and then they're like, whoa, what's going on here? And I don't think it has to be that way. I don't think it has to be that way. If you think about American English, pretty much everybody understands us. And it's not because we have the best form of English. It's because Hollywood is a soft power. Everybody watches American movies, American TV. And that leads to a high level of understanding. So that's from my personal take. It's not, I don't know exactly what the official take is, but I say get as exposed as possible.
Yeah, I also think, like at work where I work now, most of the developer team are not from the UK. We have Chinese guys, and we have the guy that I work with a lot is from Bulgaria. We've got a guy in Romania, and we speak English to each other. None of them sound like they're from England or from, they sound Bulgarian or Chinese English. And so I don't see myself, I know if you want to have like a pure accent, maybe you can be super pure. But I agree with you. I Spain is obviously not that far away for me, and so I wouldn't want to go to, if the first Spanish country that I go to is Spain and I can't get around in Spain, that would be a waste of all the time that I spent learning Spanish. So yeah, so the Argentine thing is super fun, but yeah, I do listen to some other stuff, and I'm certainly interested in understanding the language overall.
Yeah, that's cool. And speaking of the UK, boy howdy, are there some accents in the UK. The diversity of English in the UK is very high. From non-natives to natives. And I'll admit my exposure to some UK varieties of English is very low. A good example, on my TikTok, I've become a TikTok addict. I'm going to bring it up a whole bunch. On my TikTok, I got some people from Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, in my feed. And they have this strange I diphthong where I would say ow, they would say I. So like how now brown cow for them sounds like hi now brown cow is sort of how people from Northern Ireland sound. And like just things like that can really do your head in a bit and make it hard to understand. But exposure, you can start making those connections. With Argentina, right? They use a special kind of post conjugation, and they have slightly different vocab sometimes than other countries, and like they don't always pronounce their S, but it's different. So like in the Caribbean, it's pretty much always they don't pronounce it, or they pronounce it as like an H. But in Argentina, they only pronounce it as an H sometimes. And like just and obviously they pronounce the Y and the LL sound kind of strange.
And even within Argentina, because I don't watch, my interests are really in nature and travel and that kind of thing, and if you follow that kind of stuff, you see that even in Argentina, it's not all Rio Platense. It's the sort of typical Argentine Spanish. There's quite a variety of different forms even within Argentina.
Mhm. For sure. Yeah. So I think the northwest of Argentina might have more Spanish settlers. So you've got multiple ways of immigration to Argentina, sort of like with America. And a lot of what we think of Argentinian Spanish is that, Rio Platense Spanish. But there are definitely other forms. Not everybody has seísmo, right? Some people have ja. And it's very interesting, using Spanish as an example. So Northern Mexican Spanish, sh for them is not the Y sound, but it's the CH sound. So, ocho muchachos would sound like ocho muchachos. And just making these connections is very fun to me. I just love it. I think it's cool. And listening to the different sort of the linguistics term is diaphone, which is like sort of the overarching sound and just things like that. There's just so much cool stuff out there. And I think it's cool that you're getting exposed to it.
Yeah. No, it's very enjoyable indeed.
So we haven't talked too much about how you kind of also organically learned German. If you want to talk about so a lot of people listening are probably not going to be familiar with Namibia. So do you want to tell us a little bit about Namibia, why there's so many German tourists, things like that?
Yeah. So if you think about colonialism in Africa, you don't really think about Germany as playing a role in it, but they and that's in part because Germany was sort of late to the game, because Germany didn't really exist when a lot of early colonialism started. But they did have a good go at it, and good or bad. They towards whatever 1880s, I guess, roughly, Germans ventured out, and there were very few places left. So Namibia is a desert country, and so nobody had really staked their claim there. And so the Germans, it was one of their few. I think they had Togo and Tanganyika, which is Tanzania, today's Tanzania, and what was then Southwest Africa, and I think I'm not sure too much about Tanganyika. I mean, one of the things we were talking about Swahili, in Tanzania there's words like shule, which comes from German, but in Namibia, a lot of people moved, a lot of Germans moved in, and they started the early businesses and mining and farming. And so when the Germans then lost all their foreign holdings during the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War, and so Namibia included, and then South Africa took over the running of Namibia, but there was quite a lot of sympathy from at least from the Afrikaners in South Africa towards the Germans, because the Germans had supported the Afrikaners in the Boer Wars before that. So they weren't kicked out. They carried on just as they had been, and so German has remained I won't say dominant, but it's a very visible language in Namibia, and still a lot of the people who, a lot of the wealthier people in the country are still German.
I am guilty of liking a wide variety of music, and there's something sort of associated with Southern Africa called Kwaito. If you've ever heard of like Kwaito music, and there's a Namibian Kwaito artist, EES, Eric Sell is his name, and he does
Okay.
sort of Kwaito music sometimes in Namibian German and
Okay.
Afrikaans.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah. So yeah, the majority of the people who speak German are from German background, but there are some. I think especially with farming communities, you have people who speak some German, some indigenous people who speak some German. So it exists. A lot of the German is almost. A lot of the Germans will say their German is purer than German, because they haven't brought in as much English and so on. So they speak a very pure form of German. So yeah, my early exposure was largely. We do have some family who speak German, not a lot, but my mother-in-law's boyfriend essentially is German, so there's a little bit of exposure there, and then yeah, I because of the legacy of German and many Germans knowing that they're German tour guides and so on, Namibia just has a lot of German tourists, so you get exposed to German through the tourists when through my job. And then I also worked for some companies where German was spoken in the office quite a bit, so I got a fair bit of exposure, and I never reached the point where I was outputting much, but certainly if I have a group of tourists who are German, I actually function fairly well with the things that they need to know. I know when they need something, their luggage is ready, or whatever, simple stuff, but I can communicate that little bit, and I understand a fair amount. I mean, that time that I was doing a lot of Pimsleur stuff, I also went through some of the Pimsleur, I think Pimsleur, whatever. I went through one of those audiobook things for German as well. So I understand, and like you said, Afrikaans is related, so it wasn't a hard language to pick up. But it's a hard language to speak.
Very similar. That's sort of the kicker, isn't it? Coming from Afrikaans to any other Germanic language is you have the shared vocab, but you don't have case like German. You don't have conjugation like German and Dutch. And you don't have gender like German and Dutch. So that's sort of the kicker, if you know the word, the word for country, right, is land in Afrikaans.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know if it's de land or het land in Dutch. You don't have any of that additional information to help, and you don't have any sort of help with verbs. The verbs are very different. Going from so that's what the kicker is, isn't it, with Afrikaans, is that it's a beautiful, I don't know, just I don't want to say simple because it sounds negative, but it's a very straightforward language, and I can see how it evolved in Southern Africa as this sort of stripped down language used by French Huguenots and people from the Low Countries and Native Africans, and I see how it evolved. But you don't have that background information converting, unfortunately.
Yeah. You mentioned Dutch. I certainly understand a lot of Dutch, and I'll try to speak to Dutch people. But my Afrikaans is not great either. So by the time it turns to Dutch, it's quite a mess. But I can make myself understood okay, and I'm more confident. I mean, I think most South Africans are fairly confident speaking to Dutch people, even though they know that they're completely mixing up the grammar and everything. People just don't feel... They feel like it's the same language, even though it's quite different.
To a Dutch person, I'm sure it sounds very interesting. There's sort of Afrikaans, very different sounds. I don't know, something about the Southern Hemisphere and the Germanic languages. Afrikaans sort of sounds like a South African accented Dutch, if that makes sense. It's not, it's not ik, it's ak. It's just it's hard to explain. But then you also have
Yeah.
the grammar, right? So it's like I to go, I go, he go, she go, and it probably sounds us go, right? Probably sounds very strange to Dutch people hearing it for the first time.
Yeah. But I guess a lot of Dutch people, I mean, I guess my exposure to Dutch people is largely through tourists, but they're very familiar with Afrikaans. I think they no one is surprised. Dutch people feel quite happy. Like, for example, if you have some Dutch tourists who, I know most Dutch people speak English just fine, but you get the odd people who don't, and they'll still travel, and they'll feel quite comfortable speaking Dutch to an Afrikaner and communicating that way without a problem as they travel around. I think they're just, certain countries have different personalities as far as their happiness to deal with language issues. Like Italians will travel without understanding a word, and they get along perfectly fine. Whereas people from some other language, from some other backgrounds, it's a little bit more difficult for them. Like Germans who don't speak English. I don't want to stereotype countries, but on the whole, in my observation, they'll feel quite uncomfortable when they don't speak the language, whereas Italians just go for it. And I think Dutch, to a certain extent, are that way as well. They're quite happy to just wing it.
Yeah, I imagine switching from Afrikaans when you were 8 to sort of Swahili and Rendile it gives you sort of you're kind of like a heritage speaker almost of Afrikaans, more than a person who you didn't go through Afrikaans schooling, right? And that probably gives you a slightly different command of the language for sure than somebody presumably like maybe your father, who presumably was educated in Afrikaans.
My father grew up in Kenya.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And then he moved to South Africa around the time of just before independence. When there was that whole violence to the build-up to independence. My grandmother was murdered during that time, and then the family moved down to South Africa. And so my grandfather was South African, but my so that's the reason why I'm British, because my father grew up British and left Kenya before independence and stayed British. But so he had his early childhood in English, and then switched to Afrikaans without knowing a word of Afrikaans when he started. So he speaks both. I mean, in our household, as a small child, my mother would speak Afrikaans and my father would speak English, and those two languages were just going all the time. So it was, in Kenya, my mother gradually spoke more and more English at home, but when she got tired at night, it's back to Afrikaans. So we had the two languages kind of on the go as if they were the same language.
Yeah, I don't think English's closeness to Afrikaans has anything to do with that. I think it's not got to do with them both being West Germanic languages. I think it's a very common thing in mixed language households. This sort of code switching.
Yeah, very common. Yeah, I mean, you see it in like with so many African families where, like in Namibia, most people will end up marrying somebody that they meet in a city where they work, rather than in the rural area where they're from. And so there's a lot of mixed households, and so it's extremely common in those households. The parents just keep speaking their language, and the child grows up super bilingual. So it's very, very common.
Oh, yeah, you had an amazing childhood, I think. You know, being able to experience the diversity of Southern and East Africa. And, I'm from the countryside as well, but not, I'm not from a desert or anything, no sort of arid place. But it sounds really interesting, having just a big outdoor space to explore, talk to kids. When you're a kid, it doesn't matter if you speak Rendile or Swahili or Afrikaans. You just want to play with your friends.
Exactly. Yeah.
And yeah, that sounds like a really cool thing to me.
Yeah. The other language, just to that I heard you mention, is Portuguese. Portuguese is spoken quite a bit in the northern part of Namibia.
Interesting.
As well, yeah. So along the Caprivi Strip and so on, you meet shopkeepers and so on. And you hear a lot of advertising in Windhoek, like on the radio in Portuguese, because you'll get oil people, like the wealthier people in Luanda will fly down to Windhoek to do their shopping.
Interesting.
So there's a whole lot of Angolan influence in Namibia. I mean, obviously those two countries were, at war essentially for 40 years, and so there's quite a lot of connection between the two.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
The Portuguese have an interesting relationship with Africa, because you have the Portuguese colonies proper. Like, you've got some of those island nations in like Northwest Africa, where like the local languages are essentially their version of Afrikaans, a couple of like Portuguese Creole languages and stuff. And then you've got these absolutely massive, people are not familiar. Africa looks tiny on a map, but it's actually quite big. The globe, when you flatten it out, it sort of distorts it. These African countries are very big. You've got Angola and Mozambique, but you also have Portuguese people who went to like the British holdings. Like, I think very famous, like I think a lot of like Southern Africans like the peri peri chicken, right, which was like brought by Portuguese immigrants. So you'll meet like people with Portuguese heritage, Portuguese last names, who are like, yeah, I'm an Afrikaner, I speak Afrikaans, because their family kind of immigrated to what is now Namibia or South Africa.
Yeah.
And that's very interesting. And yeah, I'm not at all surprised that people from Luanda, they fly to Windhoek and they do their shopping.
Yeah, they can buy South African things there. So Luanda is, I've never been to Luanda, but I believe it's fairly limited. So it's a strange country. It's got extremely rich people in tiny point something percent, and then destitute poverty through a lot of the rest of the country.
This I always feel strange talking about social issues because it's not really my forte, but I think this is common in countries that are like land/mineral rich. People get in early, they get the rights to the oil, and then you sort of have these like modern day oil barons. Whereas countries that don't have that sort of dependence on extracting wealth from the environment tend to be much more balanced, I guess, where you don't have that same degree of like really rich people and really poor people. And I believe Angola might be one of those oil countries.
Very much so, yeah. But I mean, Angola's, I also don't want to, I'm also not an expert in this stuff, but Angola was also a country at war for so long. It's been this country that suffered tremendously. So it'll have an impact for a couple of generations still.
Yeah, and the colonization with colonies, it's different for each colony. Cuba, for example, was viewed as an essential part of Spain. It wasn't necessarily viewed as a colony. This was part of Spain. And the Portuguese decolonized Africa very recently, like within living memory. And I've definitely heard some of the pro-Portuguese propaganda songs. There's one, Angola é nossa, Angola is ours. So like, they got their freedom, then they had the sort of the what they call it, the Bush War, is that the name of it?
Yes. Yeah.
There's a couple of like Afrikaans songs talking about Clayton, which I think is like the border of what is now Angola and Namibia, maybe.
Yeah.
Because I think that might have been like Namibia/South Africa's version of like Vietnam, right? A lot of young people getting sent to war, and it was not necessarily the most popular war.
Yeah. I mean, I am of the age. I'm 51, and I think pretty much when I finished high school, the intake into what do you call it, mandatory inscription ended, and I was actually on my way to the military, and then was told I'm not going, which I'm extremely thankful for, knowing now what I do. But we didn't know much, and so pretty much everybody who's older than me and younger than my father was at war, or at least up on the border to close to war. So it was.
Yeah, and I know that it definitely plays a role in the sort of the folklore of modern South Africans. There's a whole bunch of, I like country music, and a lot of Afrikaner music is similar to country music, and they've got these sort of songs that reminisce about 18-year-olds being sent off to the Bush War and things like that. And it was very fun to talk to you today, Vernon. We're about at time. Before we go, is there anything I didn't ask that you wanted to talk about? And what is your piece of advice that you would give to people?
I mean, I guess my language learning advice would be consistency. But I think that's the advice everyone gives. My biggest advice is I think my biggest advice is make it really fun. Like you don't have to be pure about it. Listen to stuff that's interesting. Make the language journey. Adapt. Learn from the techniques, but make it super fun for yourself.
All right. And anything that I didn't bring up that you wanted to talk about, more about, I don't know, SIL, your time in various places?
Maybe I can quickly talk about my father's language learning approach.
Sure.
Just because I think that's interesting. Because the whole reason why I even contacted you was because I was chatting to my dad about Refold and saying, how did your language learning go? And this is quite interesting. And it was kind of an input-based approach. So what he would do is he had a big tape recorder and a microphone, and he'd go out to the wells. The wells is the social center of Rendeli life, because everyone brings their animals in, and then while they're watering their animals, they catch up with the gossip and everything, and then they all go off in the bush again. And so my father would go sit by the wells, and he would just record a small conversation, and then he'd go back in the afternoon, and he would work with some translators who would tell him the bits that translate the bits that he's recorded. And he did not output for a very long time. He worked through translators and just recorded all this. So he had stacks and stacks of tapes of, people might not know what tapes are, but
like cassette tapes.
Cassette tapes, yeah. And
they're still used today. I used to work in medicine, and my doctor would dictate. So he would dictate his written report, and he, up until, let's see, I left medicine. I left doing forensic work like a decade ago. But at least as of 10 years ago, there are doctors out there who dictate their medical reports on physical tapes. So they're still used.
Okay, yeah. But like my kids don't know what they are. So
gotcha.
Yeah. So he would listen to those over and over again. And so it was not that dissimilar to the approach that we're using to learn the language now. And my father he wrote with help a grammar system and alphabet and everything for the language, and he speaks that language absolutely. I mean, I think he knows the language better than some natives because he's made so much effort to learn every corner of it. Yeah, it was interesting to me that really their approach, and he obviously followed the SIL approach at the time. I don't know if that's evolved since then, but it was very much this approach of gathering input and going over it and over it. So, yeah.
Well, in the future, if I get the chance, I would love to talk to your father and hear it straight from him.
Yeah,
his experience making a reference grammar for this language documentation, right? And that sounds really cool.
Yeah.
Vernon, thank you so much for coming on, and I will see you in the community.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold podcast. If you're watching the live premiere, you're in luck. Right as it ends, we have an after party over on the Refold Central Discord server. Come join us by using refold.link/join and chat about the episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to hear more, you can find older episodes to listen to on YouTube and Spotify. Let us know what you thought about the video by liking and leaving a comment below. Do you have suggestions for upcoming visitors or requests for particular topics? Please feel free to reach out to me on Discord at GeorgePig #5413 or via email at clayton@refold.la. Thank you all for watching and or listening, and I'll see you next week.
Hey, as you know, there's a lot of language learning advice out there, which can make it kind of overwhelming and difficult to actually get going on your own learning. If you feel like you're struggling to figure out language learning, you're not alone. It's an extremely complicated process with tons of different steps. If you're looking for a step-by-step guide to create the perfect language learning routine for you, then you have to check out our new course. We spent thousands of hours designing a simple and straightforward process that you can use to create your own personalized language routine that actually works. We understand that every learner is different and that you have to roll with the punches and adapt. Every day for 30 days, I walk you through everything you need to know to build an effective learning routine, no matter your circumstances. We give you the advice and resources you need to ensure your success, so you don't have to waste time looking for stuff to do and can focus on learning. And if any questions do come up, don't worry. We are always there to answer any questions and clear up confusion. And it's all backed by our 90-day, no questions asked, money-back guarantee. If, for whatever reason, something's not quite working for you, we insist you get every penny back. It's time for you to stop wishing that you could learn a second language. It's time to become the master of your language learning journey. Check out the link below to get instant access and start your journey today.